Coffee Sessions. I am Robin, and I am here with our first interviewee for the podcast, our feature for next week, HR Webster, who is sitting to my right. I'm super excited to be here today. This is our first time meeting, although we have kind of met before.
We passed.
Yeah.
We read together.
We both performed at O Positive last year, which was super fun. And I was like, I need to get this girl on my stage. Not my stage, obviously, David's stage, but the stage of Greenkill for the night, and this is the first podcast for White Noise, which has been, spoken about through email with me and David. I was just like, I want to do this. And David's like, okay, let's do it. And that's basically how it went. And I feel like it's a great opportunity to highlight our features for the month, and give artists more of a platform, because that's I think one of the main goals in White Noise in general is to highlight local artists and performers, and I'll be a little biased, poets especially, and that's why we're here tonight, and we're just gonna have a frank conversation about art and maybe a little bit about life, even though that can be a little scary. So let's just jump right into it. My first question for you: who is HR Webster?
Oh, I'm not even sure how to answer that. I'm a poet. I live here in Kingston. I'm a teacher. I have a big garden and 2 loud dogs, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me on tonight.
Of course. Thank you for coming. And we will be back next week as well, almost a week from today, and you will be performing on the stage again in a very different way. And I think this is a great platform to introduce and then get people excited for what's to come.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the performance.
Yeah, same.
Trying out new work with a live audience is always really helpful to me in my writing process. Just an opportunity to hear words in a big room and feel people's response to it is just a wonderful opportunity, and to connect with other artists.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back a little bit and talk a bit about your artistic and specifically poetic beginnings, and how did that start for you? Was it just you woke up one morning and decided to be a poet like the rest of us? Or
Yeah, I wrote poetry from when I was like 6 or 7 years old. I grew up really loving the natural world and loving, children's poetry, and the poetry of Emily Dickinson was really important to me. And I also just grew up out in the countryside, and the sort of lonely time in the woods by myself a lot of the time, and I just felt that I didn't have all the tools for expressing everything I was feeling, and poetry let me sort of fail at expressing all that I was feeling even then, and I fell in love with it, and I kept writing, for my whole life after that.
Yeah, beautiful. I can kind of say the same. I think it has to be just something within you. Just I started out more with doing like comic strips and stuff. and then I guess that developed into poetry in its own way.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me because
Yeah.
comic strips are all about, elision as well and white space as well. So there's a sort of beautiful relationship between comics and poetry, I think.
Totally. And I think comics can be so poetic. I grew up reading like Calvin and Hobbes and stuff. And
yeah, it's absolute poetry.
oh my God, right? It's crazy what, kids used to read. I don't know what kids are reading now. I hope they're reading Calvin and Hobbes.
Can only wish.
So my next question is kind of a big one, but I think it relates to poetic beginnings as well. So to you, what would you say is the purpose of poetry, and how does it mesh with your life?
I mean, I would say that there's no one singular purpose for poetry, and I often think about George Orwell's, famous essay, Why I Write, and his belief that all writing is political, even, the writing that refuses to be political, that is in and of itself, of course, political. And so though he sort of maps all of these different purposes for writing, in the end he comes back to, whether it's for the sort of aesthetic bliss of language, or whether it's, simply because you want, people to remember you and pay attention to you, all of it comes down to, a political choice to speak truth about the world. And I do think that that is the purpose that I feel closest to for writing, even when it's not on the surface of what I'm saying in a poem. It always comes down to that the purpose of writing is inherently political for me.
And would you say that when you first began writing, were those inklings still there? Or was that, when did that, maybe not the word is change, but when did you first notice that in your writing?
Well, if you look back, you can always sort of, map things onto the past in any way that you want. And so if I think about, the first poems that I was writing which were sort of basically like, wow, look at this tree poems. But I also, had a, deep awareness of a child of environmental degradation and sort of the risks to our environment. But I don't think that was consciously inspiring, wow, look at this tree. I think I was just psyched about the tree. But I think, I think it just, that awareness comes from being in the world and seeing the way that kind of neoliberal institutions are kind of always sucking the meaning out of this thing that we have in common with each other, this language that we have in common, and a desire to kind of push back against the sort of meaninglessness that is used against language sometimes. So it wasn't an aha moment, but it was just kind of anti-authoritarian instinct, I guess, that sort of develops over time.
Yeah, being a teenager.
But I've kept that teenage heart.
Yeah, that never really goes away, does it?
Not if you hold on to it tight.
Yeah, of course. And I guess that leads into a bit more about development in itself with writing. I think as poets we go through so many different chapters and maybe even phases and things we experiment with. And how would you, we talked about mapping a little bit already, how would you map your progression? What would you say has led you, whether culturally, societally, things that you've observed, to where you are now in your writing?
I mean, part of it is the teachers that you have and the teachers that you have through reading their work. And, you know, I'm never writing poetry unless I'm reading poetry. And what I'm reading is always my teacher. Part of it is place. And we talked about mapping sort of abstractly, but I think place has a really important role in my writing process and my poetry. And so where I am and what I am doing is always going to influence that. And, you know, it's just like the deep listening to the people around you is a part of that. It's hard to sort of think about specific turning moments sometimes, or maybe for me it has to do with who my teacher was and where I was most of all at a different time, and how safe I felt experimenting and taking risks. And it's sort of those moments where you feel safe to try something new that move your work in interesting directions, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally relate to that too. I think especially in the past year, I've noticed that so much more in my writing as well. Just, it's like totally a reaction to what I am reading. And I think just naturally for writers, everything is a reaction to what we observe. But I think being well-read is so important as a writer. I think it kind of just is a part of it, but I think for me at least, it did strike me in a way where I was like, wow, this really changed my writing. So I guess to reframe the question a little bit, was there, or are there writers who have been touchstones for you?
A writer who's a really important poet for me is Jean Valentine. I'm trying to think about like how to articulate sort of why she's such a touchstone for me. I think she's sort of a poet with a unique ability to capture silence and the unsaid, and it's something that I go to her work for often. And Lucy Brock-Broido is another poet who I adore in terms of the tension between what is in excess and what is in lack is so present in her work, and it's important to me for that reason. Those are a few people who are not physical teachers of mine, but poetry teachers of mine.
Yeah, I actually haven't heard of either of those poets before.
Oh, strong recommend.
Yeah, I'm going to have to obviously rewatch this and write them down.
Both of them died, unfortunately, in the last 10 years. Yeah.
As are many of our favorites. And how did you discover these two writers? I feel like discovery for me is always been super big. Like, I found some of my favorite writers in, you know, tucked away parts of bookstores, and I'm like, how did I come upon this, you know? So was it a person who recommended them, or?
Yeah, I think community's been so important to me, and having the people in your life who say, I've read this and I thought of you, have you ever read this, is vital. And then, you know, those poets who you're recommended were also in community with each other and knew each other, and you can sort of trace those connections. And so there's kind of these networks of connection between, you know, the poets in your life who recommend things to you and the poets in those poets' lives. And I think that's often how I discover things. And I still read literary journals. I still get paper copies of literary journals. I worked in literary journals for a while, and I think they're still one of the best possible routes into discovery of poets.
Yeah. Any ones you're currently reading you'd want to shout out?
Oh, no. Well, I worked for a long time with the Michigan Quarterly Review, and I still have a soft spot for their project and everything that they do, especially publishing international writers. And I don't know. There's so many that I love. Are you a reader of literary journals?
I'm getting into it more. I mainly read online. I want to get more print copies because I think I retain more when I read in print. When I read online, it doesn't stick for some reason. Yeah. I think that's just like my brain. I'm someone who needs to be like taking notes, so that's like a huge part of my process.
Get the Paris Review, start
Scribbling
in it.
Right. Yes, but I have been subscribing to some stuff, trying to see what's out there. Also, leads into another section that I wanted to talk about with you, which is publishing in general, because I think for a lot of, young poets out there who are trying to get into publishing their own work, the whole world of publishing is kind of daunting and a little scary. It's huge. And it's like bigger the more you look into it. So, what has your experience been with that?
I think for young poets trying to get into literary journals, if you can read submissions for a literary journal, if you can sort of see the other side of that screen, it's really helpful in demystifying that, and also helps you see that it's not you when it's hard to get your work published, and also helps you understand that sort of the kind of remarkable number of people out there writing poems and sending their poems into the world. It's kind of exciting and inspiring for an art form that we're constantly being told is dead or dying.
Right.
I published a book with a small press, Black Lawrence Press, in 2022, and it, is a book that I wrote over almost 10 years of writing poetry. It'll probably be 10 more years. When I'm 3 down on it, I'm giving myself 7 more years to write another book. I think the important thing about publishing work is, I was reminded of this recently, that don't see it as a gift that someone is giving to you to publish your work. You have to see it as that you're finding the people who truly see your work. You're searching them out, and that from there it's a collaboration. So it's not a favor that's being done to you. It's something that you're doing together. Yeah. And I think the more we believe that, the more we can hold literary institutions accountable. Yeah. And ask them to be transparent as well.
Totally. Yeah, I think, one thing for me when I was starting out is like anywhere I got into, I was like, oh my God, what a privilege. And it is to an extent, especially when you need that validation for your own poetry, and just to be like, wow, someone thinks this is great. But I've also found that the more I publish and the more I get out there, I separate from that a little bit. And I've learned to be more choosy, because I think that's so important and undervalued, especially, when you're starting out. At least, in my journey so far. Because it's challenging to get so many rejections, and that's just inherently part of the process. But I think it's just best to take it with grace, and just Absolutely. It wasn't meant to be there. They didn't deserve it. So I really like that outlook on it.
Yeah, and I think that the more you know, come to open mics and make friends who read your work, and the more you're seeking that validation from people who know and are invested in your work, and less from these sort of anonymous symbolic entities, the better off we all are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, for some people, I can see it as just another line in your bio, you know, and what does that really mean? Is that just, you know, and then it makes me think of some of the superficiality of the industry as well, and how a lot of that is based on prestige and stuff, like you were saying. And that's when, you know, for me, I'm like, how do we discern the, you know, the trustworthy from the people who are just, you know, there for the clout, you know? Because even in the literary world, I think that's still so prevalent. And I'm not gonna call anyone out specifically, but I read a Times article recently about a publication, and I think the Times was just kind of trashing them a little bit, and they were like, whatever, we know we suck, you know. And I'm like interesting energy. But yeah, I don't know, what has your experience been with publications like that?
I mean, I've you know, I've been very lucky to be able to publish poems, and I've also you know, in the last year chosen to withdraw pieces from a literary journal that was refusing to support people calling for an end to the genocide in Palestine.
Wow.
And I think that that's why the mindset where you're, you know, your work is, we can only say that we value our work if we sort of approach it with integrity.
Absolutely.
And yeah, you know, beyond that, like I love the literary world mess. I love when people sort of make fools of themselves. I love when I make a fool of myself. You know, I love silliness. But at the end of the day, like, if you believe in poetry, you believe in poetry.
Yeah, I agree. And I think being choosy is one of the most selfless things we can do. Selfless and a little selfish, but mainly selfless, because you're doing it for other people too. I think, you know, it's helping weed out some of the, like I was saying, you know, superficiality out there. And I know that's also very subjective, so I think it's best to just, you know, take your time. At least for me, I've taken my time in figuring out publications that I resonate with, and
I think that taking your time and not seeing your poetry as a sort of a product that you can sell in the marketplace of attention is important. And I think that we're all sort of inside capitalism, and we feel the sort of rush to market ourselves, and we feel the pressure to be exceptional in a way that at the end doesn't necessarily do the work service, and also doesn't do service to the work of, you know, poetry that happens in conversation with other people.
Right. Absolutely. Interesting. Yeah. Publishing is something I think I've been up and down with, this, like I was saying, need for just the acceptance. But, in an industry that is, there are just, it baffles me sometimes how many places there are to submit to. And, you could just take weeks sorting through and finding what works. And then a lot of places aren't even on like platforms, like, big ones out there, like Chill Subs, which is great and a very valuable resource. But I found some of the best publications just like, Instagram threads where I'm just like, this person follows this person, and then also seeing some of my favorite modern poets and who they've been published by and who they're connected to.
That's, I think, the trick is you go to the acknowledgements page of a book that you absolutely love and feel connected to and say, okay, what's in here? But yeah, I think that the sort of, it's possible to write poetry entirely as a private act. And we're up here on a stage right now, like we believe in poetry as a public act.
Yeah.
And, but I think I've realized that, if one person emails me through my website and says like, oh, I really thank you for writing this book, that's all I need.
Yeah.
That's the validation. And that doesn't always have anything to do with like the size of the platform that work is published in.
Absolutely.
It has the most to do with like saying yes to doing all sorts of things and saying yes to people and inviting people to do things and making those sort of rhizomal connections.
Yeah. I've found that, my writing has developed the most in community. And especially since white noise began, just even though this is a space for all performers, being able to have a platform for poets like myself and, young like high school poets and stuff, that is just like the coolest thing, just to know that, they have that space. And, I think it's just a testament that there needs to be more of those out there. Because people, when they don't know that it's there, they're not going to be sharing their work if there's not, a space they feel comfortable in. So yeah, that was a bit of a tangent, but it just got me thinking of that. So we talked about some of your big poetic influences. Who would you say are some of your favorite modern and contemporary poets?
Well, yeah, those are modern and contemporary. I think, I love Diane Seuss's work. I lived in the Midwest. I lived in Michigan for a long time, and her sort of connection to that place and sort of the kind of deep formalism and messy feminism of her work is something that I really love. Her way with images.
Yeah.
There's so many other poets I love. I went to a great reading in Kingston the other night. I saw Saray Jarrell James read, and that was just, remarkable poetry happening right here in Kingston. So there's so many people. Is there anyone you've been reading recently that you're excited about?
Poetry-wise, no. I've been reading Garielle Lutz.
I don't know.
She's a fiction writer, short fiction, kind of very microfiction. But writing like I've never read before, just the way that she uses I mean, she just takes words and I'm going to say like she takes words and completely transforms them. But no, it's just like, it's definitely like an experience reading her stuff, because it's very focused on mundane and, just relationships, working in an office, stuff like that. But it's the way that she describes them. It's really about her language, because there's really no plot in her stories. It's just her focus on language that has been inspiring me. Even though it's so hard for me to grasp. I feel like I'm like constantly like climbing up an endless staircase when I read her stories. Or a ladder, I guess it was more of like a ladder. But yeah, I've been reading her. She's, still publishing, and I guess in terms of poetry, Eileen Myles has been my fave. I
love Eileen.
Yeah, read them for the first time last year, and then wrote a whole book right after. I was just so inspired by them.
And it's interesting, there's poets who you love and admire, and they don't make you write more.
Yeah.
You just are kind of in a stew of love for them. And then there's poets who you read, and all of a sudden it's you're writing again out of nowhere. And
it unlocks something, And I think it's, for me, form is a big thing as well. I don't know about if that's something you play with your poetry.
Yeah.
What has that been like for you? How would you say you use form?
I write in form quite a lot. And I think, and sometimes I use form as a revision tool. So I will write something in free verse, bring it into form, and then bring it back out of form, in part because I think I love surprise. I love being surprised, and I sort of hate fake surprise in poetry. And I think, so form is a way for me to surprise myself.
Yeah.
But I've been writing a lot in terzerima and in sonnets recently. And I've been writing a lot about like grief in the form of sonnets, and I've been trying to figure out sort of why that form feels really appropriate to me. And it might just be that I think the experience of grief so much is sort of all like sort of turning forward and turning back and turning forward and turning back so often.
Right.
And it is sort of really an experience of moments in a way that I think a sonnet is apt for capturing.
Yeah.
What is your... now I'm just like asking you questions right back,
okay.
But I'm interested. What's your relationship to form been?
Well,
I was surprised because you said Eileen Myles and then you said form, and I was like, huh.
Well, interestingly enough, my relationship with form is not about like, I don't write like sonnets or villanelles or anything like that. Also interesting, you brought up sonnets right after mentioning Diane Seuss. I was thinking that, the best. But I think my experience with form, I guess, is a lack of structured traditional form and more, I guess you would call it free verse, but I see it more as the visual aspect of form. Because I think, for me, I feel a bit boxed in by the term free verse, because it's so open and expansive. But I feel like if you just called all of my poetry free verse, that's just like one box. But I feel like there are different shapes and sizes it takes, and I think that is more of my form. It's the way that it looks on the page, the visual aspect of
Well,
form.
I think all poetry is in form.
Right, absolutely.
And just as all poetry is political, all poetry is in form. And something I've really appreciated recently is how many contemporary poets are kind of interested in naming and, you know, what we would have called like a nonce form, but are now sort of these sort of proliferations of invented form through the poetry community, and the sort of claiming one's ability to make a form, I think is kind of an exciting thing about what's happening in poetry now.
I've never heard of this, actually. Could you tell me a bit more about it?
You know, Terence Hayes invented the form of the golden shovel, which has then been sort of reinvented in all of these different ways, or Jericho Brown's invention of the duplex poem, which has then been sort of played with or expanded in all of these different kind of refracted ways since then. And so it's sort of creating these new forms because of what you're talking about, that feeling of the box of free verse, and also a sort of desire to engage with the history of received form critically. And so that can come from, you know, Wanda Coleman's American Sonnet, or it can come from a sort of, you know, claiming your ability to create form. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And I wasn't thinking that initially when you were talking about it, but I can totally see that in so many different writers. I guess there's just not a name for what they do yet.
But you can make one. You can make
exactly.
a name.
And that's
Go
the fun
ahead.
part. I do love a good label. I love a good way of describing something. You know, we are writers at the end of the day. We can't help it. So very interesting. I have to see, you know, because how would you describe, you know, Eileen Miles's poetry? Because there is definitely a lack of traditional structure, but I would say that they are in a form of their own. You know, kind of the terse lines, and the way they just sprawl down the pages.
Yeah, maybe it's not a word. It's when they read, you know, they throw the pages on the floor, and it's just the sound that it makes when it hits the floor. That's the name of the form. Yeah, that's the name of the form for Eileen.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I've never seen them perform live before. Have you seen them perform? Oh my God. How was that?
And, you know, Eileen Miles will, like, I lived in Provincetown, Massachusetts for a while, and they're sort of frequently there, and they would come to like an open mic with 15 people and try out work and hang out. Wow. And so there's somebody who believes in poetry community with integrity and intimacy in a way that at their sort of, you know, level of prestige is not common. I appreciate that about them. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's also something I've sensed just from stalking them on Instagram.
I mean, they have a very good Instagram.
Yeah,
also.
it's very inspiring. You know,
if you want to adopt a pit bull,
right? I have seen that.
Good place to go.
Wow. Yeah, but definitely, a big writer who has inspired me and also had me thinking about another writer that I found when I was in Scotland last year and just picked up this book like randomly at a bookstore and ended up becoming so inspired by this writer. His name's Ray Hollingsworth. He's an English poet, and the thing is, like, I don't really know too much about him, and sometimes I like not knowing. You know, I like the anonymity of, you know, reading a poet and just, you know, having this one book be their whole identity, and just leaving it there. But, you know, the way that they created their poetry was so, the movement was just like infective to me, and just made me write these insane poems. But I really love when poets can totally, you know, I almost feel like poisoned, and I'm like, wow, I have to get this poison out of me now, you know. I find that happens not a lot, but when it does, it's when I write my most fruitful stuff. But going back a little bit, because this isn't about me, I'm curious about what your experience has been with performance in your poetry, and what, you know, where did performance start for you, and how integral would you say is it to, you know, the way that you write?
Yeah, my partner is a poet, and we have a joke that all poets wanted to be musicians and became poets instead, and or they wanted to be painters and became poets instead. And that sort of, you come to poetry through failure in another art form. And this is not strictly true. Of course, many people dream of becoming poets, but I think I was a painter rather than a musician in a previous life, in other alternative version of reality. And so I think for that reason I came to performance really late in my life as a poet, and kind of necessity, that it's sort of a part of being a poet in the world is to perform. And that isn't to say that I haven't come to love it and appreciate it, and that it hasn't sort of begun to influence the way that I write. I love poems with serious jokes in them. Yeah. And I think those require a collaborator in the form of an audience to work. And so I think that is something that, you know, performing more frequently is brought to my poetry, is that I want people to laugh and then maybe feel a little bit bad about laughing. But yeah, performance, I don't think I probably performed poetry, you know, once or twice as a teenager, and then not again until I was at graduate school. So it's been a learning process for me, certainly. And I think I'm really glad that some of the sort of, you know, when I was first kind of connecting more with not poetry, but the kind of world of poetry, it was often talked about in these binaries of there were sort of performance poets and then there were page poets. And I think that people don't talk about it that way anymore. It's something I'm really grateful for, that is, that some of the kind of stigmatizing implications of that and have broken down, and that we're all page and performance and video and all these things poets now. Yeah,
I think that's a super important binary to note. You know, as you know, going back to this idea of being a young poet again, there is a huge fear of performing that I think most people, at least, you know, in my experience of having this event, I've encountered most poets who come on the stage here for their first time. It's just like the scariest thing they've ever done in their life. But then once they do, it's like the most empowering thing, you know, because I'm always going to be scared of it. Yeah. It does not matter if there's two people. I gave a reading at a bookstore once where it was my aunt, my parents, and one other person. And I was shaking like a leaf. Like, I will always be a nervous performer. Yeah. And it's, I'm never going to feel particularly good when it's happening. I'm only going to feel relieved and maybe a little stinky when it's done. I'm sweating so much. Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that it isn't, that I just don't get something from that nervousness.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, if you still experience that performance anxiety, because I do too. You know, even as a host, it's like an interesting dynamic, because I have to have confidence because I host. But at the same time, like internally, I'm like, what if I'm like just particularly anxious that day? I can't show that on stage, because if I do, then everyone else is going to get a little nervous. But that performance anxiety does not ever go away, I don't think. And people who don't have it, I'm like, wow, you know. I've met a few, you know, especially, you know, strictly spoken word poets who are just like so commanding on stage, and it just like, it looks like they're not anxious, but they probably are in their own way too.
They probably are. But I do feel, because performing is something that you are always asked to do, I do think it is like, I know, I felt like a responsibility to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
You know, you can see poets perform or give readings, and it's clear that they do not want to be there, and it is clear that they do not see this as a part of their craft, and it's simply, you know, something that they've been told they have to do. And so I do think it is, you know, important to learn to make the anxiety work for you, and learn how to have that relationship with an audience in some way. Because it's always going to be a part of being a poet. I mean, it's the sort of deepest root of it. So
it is the oral tradition and everything. I think it's, you know, it's interesting to think about, because I think it's totally become not conscious for me as much anymore, because I've gotten just so used to getting up on stage, and especially this stage. You know, this stage is where
it's your
feel,
home. You got a home field advantage.
Yeah,
you know?
that's so. It's so true. I'm very privileged to have this stage, because as I was saying to you before the cameras started rolling, this was the first stage I ever performed on with my poetry, and you know, it's, you know, the anxiety's gotten a little less, but not that much. But, you know, it's good. The anxiety, you know, someone once told me that anxiety is just, you know, it reminds you that you're alive. So I try to take it like that. Like, okay, I'm feeling these things because I'm alive and supposed to feel these things.
And you care about it, you know.
And I care. Yeah, exactly. Are there any, you know, performers, I guess poetry performers, that you're particularly inspired by out there that you've seen, whether it was just like a...
I mean, we were talking about Eileen Miles, and they're a wonderful performer. I'm a sucker for Mary Ruefle's performances, which are not big. You know, there's definitely some, you know, Martina Spada is a big performer and has a big voice, but Mary Ruefle famously did a performance as part of readings that she would do, where she would teach you how to fold a fitted sheet. Now I know how to fold a fitted sheet, which is a big plus in my life, but also just seeing somebody kind of think beyond standing at the podium and think about sort of thinking about surprise as part of a performance of poetry.
That's so interesting. I've also been thinking a bit about, I guess surprise is a good way to put it, you know, because it is a connection you're creating with the audience. And if it's the same thing every time, to what extent are you benefiting from that? I mean, you totally could, because I think I still benefit from it every time. But there is a part of me where I'm like, what if I was just to do something totally out of left field, you know?
Yeah.
But I don't know what I would do. Maybe I'll just like do it one time, you know, just surprise myself.
Yeah. I hope I'm here when it happens.
Yeah, maybe it'll be next Tuesday. So let's go back a little bit, because you mentioned your book, and I don't want to just gloss over that. I obviously want to talk about your book a little bit. So I have heard of Black Lawrence Press. I think I maybe submitted to them once. So tell me a bit more about how you found this publisher and what that experience was like.
Trying to think. It's a slow process publishing a book, and I had a sort of faster process, I think, than many, and just in terms of that they had a place in their publishing schedule for the book, and were excited about it. I think it's a book that I'm very proud of, but it's not the thing that holds the poems together in it. Is a way of seeing the world, rather than an explicit project. And so I sort of decided that submitting it through open reading periods rather than book contests was a good route for me for that reason, and I think that's true. And I think that Black Lawrence has been really wonderful. They've have limited resources in terms of publicity. I had to sort of go out there and knock on doors and make noise for myself, but everything that they had, they put behind it. They let me work with a cover designer who's really somebody who's important to me. And it's scary, it's because when you work on a book over such a long part of your life, publishing it all of a sudden when you're performing and when you're talking about it, you have to remember the person you were 10 years before, and 9 years before, and 8 years before, and you don't always like that person. You don't, sometimes you're worried about that person. And so I think it was, it's more vulnerable than just, sharing poetry is always vulnerable. And, but it's even more vulnerable than that, because you are accountable for all of these sort of past versions of yourself when you're putting it out there. So that was exciting and terrifying for me. But it was a great process. And going back to surprise, I think, it's exciting to put a book together and see the conversations that happen between poems that you didn't even sort of recognize before that moment. So that was a fun process to sort of put the poems in order and do all of that. Yeah.
So what was that experience like, just, having those poems be created over the span of 10 years? I think for me that's so interesting, because all of, I have one book published and one coming out this year.
Oh, and congratulations.
Thank you. And both of those books were written super quickly. And I find that even the book I have coming out this year, I'm already like, I don't know how I feel about some of these poems. And I think it's, that patience is definitely a virtue, and something I don't have. But, I think, and then my first book, I hardly even look at it, because I'm like, this was me like 6 years ago. Like, I can't, how could I even know this person? So I guess I'm assuming the editing process was pretty intense.
It was, and I think you're part of a long tradition of poets who disavow their earlier work.
Yeah.
I think poets will put together their selected, and it'll be one poem from an early book, or two poems from each of their first two books, and that's it's of course, because we're growing and evolving and changing, and we should be trying new things all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, the editing process, there are hundreds of poems that I wrote in those 10 years that aren't in the book. And I think there's just no right way to write a book. When we're young, we're sort of constantly bombarded with this idea that, writing, you should write every day, or you should, that you need a writing routine, and that things should look one way. And, I think it's fantastic to write a book really quickly and then publish it. Like, I think that's wonderful. So there's just no right way to do it. And, but I am, very practiced now in cutting through everything that I've written, to see what still has meaning to me.
Yeah. And so what is that meaning exactly? Is there like was there some thematic, thread that tied all of these poems together for you? How did that process look of choosing the ones that made the final cut?
No, there really isn't. I mean, there are themes that emerged kind of after the fact. There's a lot of work in there about sort of relationships between humans and animals, sort of visions of the necropastoral and experiences of survival. But the other poems are about that shit too. So no, I think it's just I don't know. It's a gut feeling, I think, at the end of the day. And I also think, as much as we talk about all of these influences and this sort of poisoning with another poet's work that can happen, or moments of sort of rapid experimentation and sort of proliferation of new ideas in your work. That's really wonderful. But then as you look back, I think sometimes you see, this is not, this is the voice of what was happening around me, whether it's another writer, or whether it's, a circumstance, or whether it's a desire to conform what you think is marketable, or whatever that might be. And I think for me, it takes distance to be able to listen to my gut about that and see what is me and what is the noise.
Yeah. Interesting. I desperately wish I could be like that.
Well, I desperately wish I could write a book in a year. So there you go.
I actually wrote the book in a month.
Okay, well.
But the whole process was kind of maybe a bit opposite to yours in that way, where there's a whole section of the book that I wrote in 2 hours. And, I really wanted to focus on, the book is called Strawberry Season, and I wrote it in the month of June because of that. The title came after, but, I think for me, I mean, I see the threads a lot more strongly in that way through my writing. I'm like, they need to all fit. They need to all like look kind of the same, or I need to have written them in the same 2 hours or whatever it is. But to actually sit down with them. I mean, I think if I waited for even, a year and then decided, what would I choose from the past year, I don't know how I would do that. Because even
it's strawberry seed. I mean, it sounds like it's a project that's about a moment and about ephemerality in some way. So that makes a lot of sense that you're sort of trying to capture that sort of June-ness, which is kind of ineffable.
I think it's just interesting that it makes me want to look at my writing a little differently too. How would I go about making a collection of my work from the past 5 years? I think that'd be super difficult for me, because 5 years ago I was still an undergrad.
It does help to be a lot older.
Right.
It does help to be old to be able to look back 5 years and trust in like a continuity of voice. And I think if you look back 5 years, there would still be things that sounded like you now in that, and the kind of seeds of, strawberry season are in work 5 years ago. It's just, it's kind of an archaeology and a sort of willingness to look hard enough to kind of map it. Yeah.
It just, I just think it's super inspiring to hear that you really took your time with this project. So how does your title work into the scope of your book in that way? What follows?
It's sort of like I'm interested in horror, and I'm interested in haunting, and I think that feeling of being haunted and sort of these inheritances was such a big theme that emerged as I looked back at the work. And this idea of, maybe sort of the dark version of the seed of the voice being there 5 years ago, but that there are things that are inescapable. And so I was kind of interested in that. And that's sort of where it came from, these biological inheritances, these sort of inheritances of violence, desires to escape, mixed with desires to remember and hold on.
Very interesting. I can see how that would lend more into a, gradual look in that way. I mean, it kind of would have to be, right? It'd be hard to do that all at once.
I mean, sometimes haunting is a slow journey, and sometimes a haunting happens, very quickly.
Yeah.
So
I feel like I've definitely been haunted for most of my life. Would you say it's what kind of haunting? I'm like kind of curious. Since once you said the word horror, my eyes kind of like lit up a little bit. I was like, oh, okay. What do you mean?
I mean,
by
there's also just poems inspired by horror movies in the book. I mean, there's a poem about Hellraiser and practical effects. So sometimes it's horror quite literally, but also this concept of Joelle McSweeney's of the necropastoral, and that there's the horror of life in the Anthropocene and the kind of and the horror of just existing in a body, and the horror of existing in relationships, are a big part of it. But I'm also a sucker for horror movies.
Yeah,
so.
Very interesting. It got me thinking of two different writers, Dorothy Lasky and her her own meditations on horror. And then one of my all-time favorite writers, Jeff Vandermeer.
Oh, yeah.
Who, definitely wrote about the Anthropocene a lot. That was huge in his big trilogy, the Annihilation trilogy. And, definitely the horror of the natural world that is so interesting. Do you feel like haunted when you're in nature? Do you feel like you're more haunted when you're in nature?
Not in nature, but I think of course, when I go into nature, I am this collision, but at the collision of humans and nature, and in terms of sort of the sort of fragmentation of nature by humans and the degradation of nature by humans, and the sort of witnessing that, I think, is a form of horror, certainly. But no, sometimes I'm in the woods and I'm just really happy to be in the woods as well.
Yeah, of course. I think that's definitely been kind of on the inverse for me. I've, definitely noticed a lot of the, like you're saying, the degradation of nature and stuff by humans. But I find that maybe it's my own feeling of unease with myself, but when I'm in nature, it's so much harder to ignore any of those feelings for me. You're just so much more present within yourself, and nature makes you feel a lot of things more than you are when you're in, Kingston or wherever, little towns, villages that we live in. Just last week when we had our open mic here, I was talking to the audience about my experience running out of nature, like literally being like, I have to leave because I'm so overwhelmed by, these feelings of, the hauntings around me.
When I read next week, I'll have to bring some poems. I went on like a solo backpacking trip a few years ago, in part because I had sort of realized I had this deep unease with myself, and I wanted to confront it. And I'd been reading just an enormous amount about kind of the history of feral children and these sort of ideas about what makes humans humans in relationship to conceptions of wilderness. And so it was like 3 weeks I was hiking by myself, and I made myself so crazy. But it was wonderful, and it was actually, I think, a turning point for my writing. It sort of changed my writing process in these interesting ways, just because I was constantly in motion and writing sort of based on memory and repetition in my head rather than just kind of putting thoughts immediately on paper. But I was recently thinking that my unease with myself has returned, and that I might have to go back into the woods by myself to get reacquaint myself with silence, and reacquaint myself with the way that I feel that silence.
And was this trip before or after you published your book?
It was right before, actually. So the poems from that time are not in the book, but it definitely was good preparation for just a confrontation with the self through publishing.
Right. So interesting how that happened. Was it, do you think, a reaction to the experience of wow, I'm publishing this book, like I need to?
No, I didn't know it was coming out.
Oh,
when
you
I
didn't
went.
know, okay.
So it was not, and it was a little bit before, and it was, but I think it was a reaction in some ways to having been in graduate school and just having a kind of enormous, talking about all of that noise that can surround you, where it can be hard to sort of discern what your voice is. That I think can be a lot of people's experience of, being in intensive writing workshops all of the time. So I think it was in some ways a reaction to that and sort of a refinding of my sense of what poetry was to me and what I wanted to write.
And where did you study?
At the University of Michigan.
Okay, you were mentioning you.
Yeah, and then I lived in and out of the Midwest for a long time after that. But yeah.
Is that where you're originally from, or?
I'm from all over North Carolina originally.
Yeah. Nice. And what brought you up to Kingston?
I lived in Kingston 12 years ago now. I was trying to remember. But yeah, about 12 years ago, and then left from there for the Midwest, and then wanted to be closer to family on the East Coast, and I had a real sort of connection to Kingston through my time here. At a different time in Kingston's life, different time in my life. But so was interested in coming back here for that reason, and to be close to people and
right.
Yeah.
How would you say, most notably noticeably, how is Kingston different from when you lived here 12 years ago?
It's much more expensive. That's the most notable thing. Lack of affordable housing. And I think, that's the most noticeable thing. And, there's the sort of like window dressing on top of that lack of affordability, which is, restaurants and stores that sell whimsical candles and whatever it might be. And, people who are like me in a lot of ways, who are, creative professionals, making their home here. And that's always, been a part of Kingston. And there's been many waves of people coming and going from Kingston, but that change has been, significant.
Yeah, I was just talking with my team at the office today, and I may have misheard them, so don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure they said that Kingston, like they were referencing an article that was just published about how Kingston has the highest increase in rent in the entire country.
I mean, I believe it, and it's, and I believe it just from, knowing my neighbors and seeing them getting displaced, and I think that it's different than it was 12 years ago.
Right.
Were you here then?
No.
You said you performed here in 2018.
Yeah.
It's not far off.
Not far off. I came here, well, not Kingston specifically. I went to SUNY New Paltz. That's where I studied. And I came here, started living in New Paltz in 2017 as a 17-year-old. And, been in the area ever since. But I didn't come to Kingston for the first time until I was 18. So in 2018, I think I may have passed through, just smoking in the car with my friends or something. But yeah, this space was really my entire introduction to Kingston for quite some time. It wasn't until I started working for the paper that I really got to know the community more. And now I'm just like in love with it here and really wish I lived here. But also I'm like, that's kind of crazy. It's crazy, but also I would do it in a heartbeat. But it's not realistic, unfortunately. Most people know I live down in Cold Spring, and long has been known as a, more, I guess, like, well-off community. It's mainly families. There's a big school district there. So, everyone is doing pretty well, and also similar rent prices, but everyone's always so surprised that I pay less than I was paying in Rosendale, in Cold Spring, where, that place has been, kind of.
Yeah, it's where I imagine Don Draper living in Mad Men. He takes the train home to Cold Spring in my head. I don't think it was actually Cold Spring, but that's how I think of Cold Spring, certainly.
It may have been Garrison. Garrison is where the 1%ers live for sure. And that's like 5 minutes from me. Cold Spring's beautiful. I love it. It's kind of weird to be living there as a journalist / poet who's so aware of these disparities. And then also, like, I live above a candle shop, and it's interesting you were just mentioning candles.
I love candles. Candles are great. They're beautiful,
and it makes my whole apartment building smell amazing, so I can't complain. And the owner is lovely, and it's a great business. But it's like, when half of the stores on Main Street are just vintage clothing stores and boutiques, or like bubble tea stores, it's not really totally accessible for a lot of people. And thankfully Beacon is pretty close, and Beacon is cool. The whole area is cool. It's just, I think my job has just made me more aware of things, and maybe sometimes I want to be, because I'm like, wow, I can't ignore these things anymore. It's so super important to be aware. And I'm glad that, I can finally feel informed in a way where I can talk about it and not feel like I'm just talking out of my ass. But it's just, I guess I say that because it weighs on you so much more, knowing the realities and seeing, families who are in need in the area and who have been living, and I speak of Kingston specifically, who have been living here for generations, and now they can't afford to live here anymore. And it's so important to know, but it doesn't make it any easier to know. Yeah. But,
I feel like that's most of the world right now. Yeah. Things that are important to know about, but it doesn't necessarily give you the power to stop it or make it any easier to know it.
Yeah, but I guess that's why we have our poetry, right?
It's true.
So let's focus a little on the present. I feel like we've been talking a bit about the past for a while. What are you working on right now? Anything in the works?
Yeah, I'm working on putting together a new manuscript and sort of a lot of poems about sort of the rise of fascism in the U.S. And about sort of the shifts during COVID and the summer of 2020, And then also just about sort of the concept and history of the ferality and to be feral, and all of these things kind of intertwined with each other. So I've been working on revising that manuscript, and some of that editing process we were talking so much about. Again, I've been lucky enough to, be at a couple of artist residencies in the last few years that have sort of given me a lot of time and space to be making new work and thinking and in conversation with other artists. And so now I'm just kind of untangling everything that I have. And just like I said, I don't have a routine and I don't write every day. But trying to just when a poem comes upon me, to give myself space to write and not worry about whether it fits into a project or whether it's good or whether it's right, just kind of making space for those poems.
Yeah. So also super interesting, you've been a part of residencies. I'm curious what those experiences were like for you, for anyone out there who's been maybe considering.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big lover of a writing residency. I mentioned I had lived in Provincetown, so I was at a residency there for 7 months, and then I went back for another winter. Residency in Maine last summer and Vermont a few summers before that. I've been really blessed to have those opportunities, and I think, I was talking about sort of in a secret, separate life, having wanted to be a painter, and I think that there's just a kind of to be around visual artists and in conversation with them and just kind of approaching so many of the same questions and problems and with the different tools for seeing is always really generative for me. And sometimes it's just wonder and sometimes it's jealousy that I can't, make the color blue in a poem. I just can't. All I've got is this kind of blunt instrument, the word or an image. So that's been really... And, they also just are, space to share meals with people and be in nature and write at 2 a.m. when you want to write at 2 a.m. and not have to worry about, vacuuming or whatever it might be, which it's remarkable how many poems have been stopped by needing to vacuum. So,
or laundry.
Yeah. Laundry, the enemy of poetry.
Oh God, no, seriously. So going into these residencies, do you have to have a proposal, an idea, or is it just like, I'm a writer, I'm going to come here to write?
You usually have to, there's an artist statement, there's a work sample. It depends completely on the residency, what they're looking for. In terms of a plan for the use of your time. You do want to be able to communicate that this is something that you need as an artist, that you're at a juncture where being in that place would be significant to you. But nobody holds you to your promises.
Right, I was going to ask.
So if you go, I think it's a common experience to go with a plan and to just find inspiration in where you are, or to bang yourself like against the wall of that plan and decide to go through the window instead. So you're not stuck with what you promise for the most part. But it's a good idea to know why you need to be there.
So did this new manuscript you're working on come out of one of these residency experiences?
Yeah, I mean, it came from backpacking, and it came from residency, and it came from, the poems I write, in my cubicle at work sometimes, or on the, I used to work, I commuted to the city, and so I wrote a lot on the train.
Yeah.
So, it comes from all of these different points in time, and it's just sort of figuring out how that all fits together right now. But it does. You'd be surprised the way that things fit together. But yeah, there's a lot of poems. I was friends with an artist in Provincetown who was sort of obsessed with the life cycle of petroleum products, and so we spent a lot of time picking up and sorting through garbage. And did marine trash pickup days, and part of that is that you actually, they need to catalog everything at the sort of Marine Research Center, and so you'd spend all your days like counting all of the bottle caps and all of the like pieces of rope of a certain length and pieces of rope of a longer length and all of the sort of pieces of lobster traps. And I think that I'm amazed by how much garbage there is in these poems. I was just like immersed in garbage for 7 months, and so there's a ton of trash in there, which is kind of fun to find. And it's a reminder, that obsession with the Anthropocene and is sort of the necrotic qualities of it. Even though it's a different project, your obsessions are your obsessions. And I think the best advice I ever got from a teacher was not to be afraid of what obsesses you, and not to run away from what obsesses you. So,
unless it's like hard drugs or something. Right.
I think you meant in your poetry.
No, right. Well, I think. I don't even know where I was going
a
with
bad
that.
crush or hard drugs or
obsession in a good
sports
way.
gambling, whatever.
Let's put a little asterisk there. Obsession in a good way. That's so interesting though, and also made me think of John Waters' obsession with trash and stuff.
Yeah, well, he's also a Provincetown person, so there you
Really?
go. Yeah, he hitchhikes there every summer.
Wow, I'm not surprised. It suits him.
A place where many of his characters lived and made their homes.
Yeah.
And that's Provincetown's like Kingston in that the weirdos are getting priced out. It's an affordable housing crisis that makes it much harder to be an art freak.
Yeah, I've been hearing a lot
person.
about Provincetown recently, actually. And I feel like this conversation also, I'm like, is this a sign that I gotta check it out? I've never been before.
Oh, God. I wouldn't suggest hitchhiking out there. It's a long way, but
I can drive.
You can drive yourself out there. It's great. It's worth it. It's wonderful in the winter time too. In like March, the right whales, there's just a handful of right whales, but they come up right off the beaches in Provincetown. You can see them.
Wow. So I guess last two quick questions.
Okay.
You might not be able to answer this, and that's totally fine, but what, off the top of your head, is your favorite line of poetry you've written?
I don't know why this there's problematic, but I still love some of Wallace Stevens's poetry. And I've always loved oh blessed rage for order, pale Ramon, from the idea of order at Key West. Yeah. But I also, he has that line, the imperfect is our paradise. And I think that's captures what I think poetry does and is the paradise of imperfection.
Yeah.
So
that's very interesting you mentioned that, because at our very first open mic I read that poem to start out.
The Idea of Order,
Yeah,
Key West.
that was the poem
go.
I read. I've always really resonated with that poem.
Yeah.
So I guess any last remarks or shout outs you want to make people out there you love who have, your mom, your dog, whoever.
Yeah. Arlo, stop barking. I can hear you even from here. No, I'm excited. I'm excited to come and read, and thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you
for having me here. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So I guess that includes our first White Noise night coffee sessions here at Greenkill. I have a few also final remarks for anyone who made it to the end. If you want to listen to this on our other platforms, this is going to be on the Greenkill Sessions YouTube page, the White Noise YouTube page, and I'm going to be posting little clips of this on our Instagram, White Noise GK, and our Facebook page, White Noise. It might be White Noise GK. I actually don't know. I should, but our next event is Tuesday, February 25th. I keep forgetting that this month and next month are identical to each other. And it's like getting me all mixed up, but because we have an event on the 25th next month too, and it's on a Tuesday. But our next event is Tuesday, February 25th, with our featured performer of the night, H.R. Webster. And that is at 7 p.m. with our regular open mic to follow. And our next events after that are Tuesday, March 7th, Tuesday, March 4th, and Tuesday, March 25th. Thank you all for tuning in, and White Noise signing off. Oh. Wow, thank you for sitting through that.